Welcome back. Since we talked about Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, in our previous historical series, we're now going to turn to the next step in the Julio-Claudian line, which is Augustus's adopted son Tiberius, and then Tiberius's grandson Caligula, who took over after Tiberius's death. So I won't spend a great deal of time going in full detail in the principles of either. It's just enough for you to understand how the principacy continued after the death of Augustus in AD 14, which turns out to have had some bumps in the road through the remainder of the Julio-Claudian line. Now, Tiberius himself was a very accomplished military general. And he and his younger brother Drusus both served in Germany and in several other major campaigns. So in the sense of being well informed about cultural aspects of the provinces as they went on a campaign, Tiberius was relatively well fitted for the position of administrator of the Roman Empire as a whole. But Tiberius also had some weaknesses. The chief problem he had was his personality. We have descriptions of the emperors from the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote two different historical works, one called Annales, about the Roman Julio-Claudian line period, and then the Histories, which are about the later period with the Flavians, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, which are not covered directly in this course. He is definitely not pleased with Tiberius. Apparently, Tiberius had a rather unsympathetic kind of rather wooden personality and had a tendency to speak in ways that didn't communicate his real thoughts very effectively. He was rather grumpy in his mood, his demeanor, and was not therefore very effective at conveying himself as a popular leader to the Roman populace. An additional minus against Tiberius, as it turns out, was that the Roman populace appreciated being both fed and treated with entertainment. This is the famous bread and circuses maxim that's so important for excuse me, for a Roman leader. You have to feed the populace and you have to entertain the populace, and if you do that successfully, bread and circuses, then you will keep the populace happy and off your own back. Well, Tiberius did not do that very well because he did not like the gladiatorial games that were often used as entertainment to keep the populace happy. He was very spare in the number of games he would put on, and therefore rendered himself rather unpopular with the Roman people as a whole. Nonetheless, for quite a few years, Tiberius was a relatively able administrator, continuing in as much as he could in the traditions now set by his predecessor, Emperor Augustus. And he did attempt to at least secure the border along Germany, which had been a rather contentious area of dispute for some time. Unfortunately, this was the area of Germany that had Augustus's main military disaster in AD 9, when 3 entire legions, led by Verus, V-E-R-U-S, were lured into Germany, into a forest by the local Germanic peoples, where they're ambushed and completely annihilated. And so this was Augustus's principal setback militarily during his administration, and the Germans threatened to break into the border and get into Gaul and further south. And so Tiberius had to spend some time during his principate going back up into Germany and securing the borders along there in order to ensure no further problems. So he was reasonably successful at doing that, and the Romans did not, at least for the time, suffer any immediate difficulties with Germany. Now, Tiberius also had some law background, and became quite interested in the legal jurisprudence at Rome itself. That, however, took a rather unsavory turn. There was a law in the books that was formalized by Augustus, although it existed previously, that referred to the so-called majesty. The word in Latin is majestas, the majesty of the Roman state. Now, I should pause for a second to talk about Roman law. Roman law itself dates, in the written form, dates all the way back to 450 BC, when the first legal written law code was put in place, and it was called the 12 Tables. It was a relatively short set of legal precepts, sometimes with language that's rather excessively brief and hard to follow, setting the first laws in place during the Republic. In time, the 12 Tables, although they continued to be the principal law of Rome, were added to with quite a few other statutes that were passed by the Senate, and in some cases also by the plebeian assembly. So by the time we get to the empire, the group of laws had been considerably expanded over those early days and had become relatively complex. So Augustus's principal aim during his principate was to neaten out the law code and pass new laws, again, in order to facilitate the administration of the empire. Now, one of the laws that was revived under Augustus was this one called majestas. The term of the formal description of the law, the crime that it mentions, is diminishing the majesty of the Roman state, which doesn't really define exactly what the person is supposed to have done, and it's left open to a great deal of interpretation. It seems to have been a law intended to keep in place outright seditious verbiage against the Republic and now the Empire. However, that could, of course, be expanded to refer to anybody who wants to criticize something about the empire or the leadership within out in public. So this was in fact a very legally shaky law to have on the books. And if it should be used by the wrong kind of leader, as turned out to be the case with the next group of Roman imperial leaders, it could become a big problem. So Tiberius gradually, because of the rather insecure state that he was in as the successor to Augustus, became increasingly suspicious of people around him, that they were possibly conspiring against him, that they didn't really support him, that they didn't necessarily support the empire. There was quite a lot of calls from time to time from different senators, for instance, about trying to restore the Republic. Something that Tiberius himself was not sympathetic to, and other members of the family definitely did not want to have happen. And so the sense of being secure in one's rule really wasn't there for Tiberius. So with that, accusations started to go around, and it became possible for a leader, if he was suspicious of a particular individual, dissatisfied with him in some way, to have a means of going after that person with this majestas law. Now, in addition to some of the trials that started to emerge from this under Tiberius Principe, we now come to this person, Sejanus. Now, what the most effective way for the Roman emperor to stay in control was, of course, to make sure that the Senate was as happy with him as possible, but also to make sure he had the loyalty of the military, and especially the Praetorian Guard. The real power behind the Roman Empire was the military, and specifically the special guard overseen by the praetor that was supposed to watch over the Roman state. Now, and particularly the safety of the Roman emperor. If that guard became dissatisfied with the emperor, that guard could ultimately resort to removing the emperor by force, which was essentially tantamount to assassinating him. Now, the head of the Praetorian Guard was this man, Sejanus. Sejanus attempted to organize a coup to overthrow Tiberius, and he did it in a very sly, slick way, rather similar to Iago with Othello and Shakespeare, by insinuating himself into the good faith of the Principate by convincing Tiberius that Tiberius had potential enemies around him, which was probably plausible, and that Sejanus was the guy to make sure that Tiberius would be kept safe. There came a point when Sejanus moved ahead with his plot and convinced Tiberius to evacuate from the city of Rome and move out to the island Capri. Tiberius did this. It turned out that this was meant for Sejanus then to have a full range of power at Rome itself, and he then proceeded to execute his own personal enemies, plus anybody else who would get in the way of his eventually seizing power over Rome itself. Eventually, however, somebody leaked the information to Tiberius of what was going on, and although Tiberius was devastated by this because he had really liked Sejanus and had relied on him personally quite a bit, he arranged for a trick to catch Sejanus off guard. He had Sejanus summoned to the Senate to receive a particular honor, and when Sejanus arrived, he entered the Senate, and one of the senators began speaking, reading off a letter sent to him by the emperor, in which it sounded at the beginning as if Sejanus was going to receive some honor, and then as the letter went through, it revealed there in the pages that in fact Sejanus was a traitor, and that he needed to be removed from office immediately, which of course he was. There was then a backlash against the reign of terror that Sejanus had effectively been setting up, and Sejanus himself and his followers were eventually executed. This terrible incident, however, pretty much undermined Tiberius' morale. He ended up never again returning to the city of Rome, and he was no longer able to function effectively as an emperor. So that left the city of Rome somewhat without effective leadership. Eventually, the Principate fell to Tiberius's grandson, originally named Gaius, but he came to be known as Caligula. This gentleman was the son of one of Tiberius's nephews named Germanicus, who was the brother of the later Emperor Claudius. Tiberius himself continued to administrate from Capri until eventually he became elderly. And then the story goes that Caligula, who was the only one left in power, except for another younger possible heir named Gemellus, arranged for the demise of Tiberius effectively by carrying out a assassination hit on Tiberius. So Tiberius was eliminated finally in AD 38, and Caligula took over. Now, unlike the very stentorian Tiberius, Caligula was young, fresh, and very charismatic. And he managed to arrange for reports to get out that Tiberius had just simply died of natural causes and had conferred the principate over to him. So therefore, there were no awkward questions about exactly how Tiberius ended up passing away. And so Caligula ended up assuming power. The name Caligula, which is not his own natural name is Gaius, comes from the Latin word caliga, which is a boot. Caligula served with his father Germanicus on campaign, as his name suggests, up in Germany. And Germanicus had Caligula dressed up in a little bitty uniform, including very small boots. And so the soldiers serving under Germanicus tended to nickname him Caligula, meaning little boot. And so that's how he gets his name. Caligula started off looking very promising as an emperor because he immediately increased a lot of public services, such as the dole. He also got the gladiatorial contest back up and running again. And so initially, all looked well. Unfortunately, however, shortly into his principate, Caligula fell seriously ill, almost dying. Something about the illness or some other thing that was going on with him completely unhinged him, and he became manic in the remaining 3 years of his short principacy. He still actually continued to administer both city and military reasonably effectively, although he did not particularly carry out much in the way of military campaigns. However, his personal life at home in the palace deteriorated rapidly, especially with his 3 sisters. Things happened behind the scenes that are rather grisly to describe. Caligula also, again, like Tiberius, became this a very suspicious person, and he also became increasingly capricious. He too started going after individual people for no particular reason whatsoever. And so ultimately, as his manic condition progressed, he became an increasing danger to the state. And finally, the Praetorian Guard arranged for Caligula's assassination during a gladiatorial game in AD 41. Caligula died in his 30s. Now, the Praetorian Guard intended for Caligula's death to bring about the restoration of the Republic. Before they could do that, however, they went through a quick sweep of the entire palace to eliminate any other members of the royal family that they could find. That unfortunately included Caligula's wife and baby child. However, they came across a closet with a curtain, and when they drew it open, they discovered the hiding, concealed figure of Caligula's uncle, Claudius. In a fateful decision, the Praetorian Guard immediately, on the spot, promoted Claudius to emperor, presumably against his wishes, although, according to the official story that we get from Suetonius in 12 Caesars, although some scholars have questioned whether it really could have come about in that rather silly-sounding way. But apparently, against his will, Claudius became the next emperor, and our next video will discuss the two principalities of Claudius and his successor, the very likely famous Nero. We'll see you next video.